Welcome to the Brute Strength Podcast, bringing you worldwide experts from all areas of health and fitness. We cover training, nutrition, coaching, and mindset. Welcome your host, strength and conditioning coach, 2012 and 2013 CrossFit Games champ, Michael Cazue. Mind, body, brute.
Hello, welcome back. My name is Mike Cazue, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This week's guest is James OPT Fitzgerald. James is one of the OGs of CrossFit, and he is a true legend in the sport as both an athlete and a coach. He was the 2007 CrossFit Games champion. He's coached dozens of CrossFit Games athletes, has been the coach to hundreds of other coaches through his OPEX training courses, and in general is one of the biggest thought leaders in the industry. First, we talk about mastery. James is someone that I truly believe is on the path of coaching mastery. We talk about how he defines that, the principles that he tries to follow, and how you can adopt some of those practices and behaviors. We talk about the mistakes he sees programmers making. We talk about program design, why simplicity is so important in training. And then we talk about the art of communication. So we go into leadership, communication, and more. While I don't agree with everything James believes, I respect the hell out of what he's doing and what he's created at OPEX. I learned a ton from this, and it is just full of little gems. I know you're going to love the show. Before we get started, if you haven't done so already, I would really appreciate you heading to iTunes and leaving me a quick review. I hope you enjoy the show. James, what's up, man? Thanks for making some time for me today.
Yeah, of course. It's great to be here.
I think we've been working on this for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years now. You're one of the busiest guys I know, so I'm pumped we finally made it happen. Like I told you, I want to dive right into this. Through researching you and just what I know about you from just following you over the years, you're someone that is truly on a path of mastery, right? You are trying to be an expert, a world-class craftsman in one thing only, which is coaching. And this is so, and one of the real things that stood out to me is in our pre-show questionnaire, you said that you have no side interest. And I think this is so common in people that are really on a path of mastery. They get so good at removing everything in their way of like reaching their goal, right? Like anything in the way of striving towards that mastery is out of their life. And I've never personally understood it because I've never experienced it myself. So I want to get a feel for where that comes from in your life. So what do you really value, and how do you find success for yourself?
Yeah, maybe I'll tie it into some of the mastery, I guess, concepts. I appreciate you bringing it up because it's not actually, what I think about day to day. It just may end up, presenting as that. So I do appreciate you noticing it for the discussion. But my priorities, I think, I don't want to classify it for a lot of people, but I think a lot of our experiences, lead to, what we would consider in our language, we call them priorities. So just intermingle values with priorities. And my priorities have moved more and more to be, I guess, more refined over time, due to experiences. So, I think, I'm 44. I have a beautiful wife and two wonderful young girls as children. I've had lots of experiences in business and in fitness. I've had a lot of physical experiences through fitness. And over time, I think, to make it simple, I think you just get old enough where you start seeing that there's only so many seconds left and there's only so many hours left. And over the years, I've just felt more and more of this pull towards making an impact on something that really allows me to sleep at night and feel good about it. And I think from that, I think it just made me align things on what is priority. And priority to me, back to your question, is teaching, learning, moving, and creating. And those are well known for me as being refined words that I try to focus on day in, day out. And then, I think your second question was on, was it what makes me successful, or what do I feel?
How do you define success for yourself?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. I think it's, how do I define success? Is happiness, is fulfillment. It's, so I define success as, and I'll just, brainstorm it, because I didn't really think about, nothing really comes to mind when I have like a cliche answer for you on that. But
right.
I think I just spoke to one of my colleagues about that just a couple hours ago, about my previous life in competition in CrossFit. And, a lot of those things taught me about completing things, being a completionist. And it sounds kind of trite or trivial to some people, but, when you set forth on an action, you decide to do something, in my mind, it does not really worthwhile unless you complete it. And so that, I think, is a lot, some of the things that come to mind when you ask, like, well, how do you define success, is some words around, happiness and fulfillment, and then completing things.
I love that. One thing I hear you saying in terms of what was the question I first asked you about, what you value is that I hear clarity, right? Like over time, you've just become more clear about what matters and what doesn't. Is there anything for a young coach or athlete listening, is there anything you would say that can, I don't know, at least make sure someone is working towards a better sense of clarity, or anything that might get in the way of that sense of clarity?
Yeah, for sure. About the things that get in the way, well, there's a lot of things that can cloud it, but I think you have to be sensitive to the time, because 2018 is definitely different than 1965, than 1858, so due to the times today and such a robust amount of information being shared, and this new definition of being social, etc., I think I'm very empathetic to the coach having a hard time of prioritizing things effectively. So first and foremost, you just want to recognize that it is really fucking hard today for a coach to get aligned and get clear on things, because everything, including Facebook and Google and everyone, is telling you to do side jobs, to hustle, to be a generalist, to, you got to be good at everything, you got to see everything, you got to know everything, et cetera, and whether you like it or not, that's what you're being told and advertised at. But so I'll just tell a coach, first and foremost, just recognize that that's the system you play in. Like the expectations in the culture out there for you as a coach are that. Secondly, to help those coaches is to recognize that your priorities change. And so it's, have the ovaries or the balls to commit to recognizing what your current priorities are, because people don't even investigate that. No one really takes the time to like sit back and go, what do I truly find important? And what am I really good at? And what really makes me feel alive? And what do I do without people watching me do that I inspire to do and that could inspire others? Not about what you do and you post on Instagram. People are like, oh, that's real cool. And you're like, ooh, they thought that was real cool. And now you're living a separate life or separate inspiration. So I'd ask coaches to do that and recognize that it changes all the time. But there's a truth to it. So what a lot of people do to the chaos today, have a problem doing, is recognizing that their actions dictate their priorities, right? So whatever you're doing and you continue to do day in, day out, are a direct reflection of your behaviors, and your repetitive behaviors are what your priorities are. So, but a lot of people don't like to hear that. They're like, oh, I want to do this. It's like, you're fucking doing nothing that's going to work towards that. It's like, oh no, I really want to. It's like, no, you're not. Let me just your day, So I think that's what would help some new coaches is, number one, it's fucking chaos out there. Number two, your priorities will change, and be okay with that. And then number 3, just look at what you're doing. That will help you dictate what's really important to get clear.
That's a knowledge bomb, man. Your actions dictate your priorities, right?
Yeah.
I heard recently, like if you want to really understand what's important to someone, look at their calendar and their bank statements.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's, those are 2 good ones. There's numerous ways to look at that. But I would agree with you. Just follow them. I'm sure you've been that way before. You're trying to figure out this little thing that you and your client are working on, but you can't walk around with them. Right. You can't be with them every waking moment. And then they present to you a week later. You're like, you're a different person. Mm-hmm. What the hell happened? And you can't get into the nitty gritty. But that's where conversation can sometimes help. I don't want to sequester it into a different point, but just having kind of a conversation with people can certainly help that.
I'm going to steal the ovary thing too. Do you have the ovaries to really go for what you want? I like that.
Well, everyone says balls, but
I love it, dude.
I want to make it gender specific.
Yeah, It's 2018 for Christ's sake. If you were on the path of mastery, how would you define mastery, and what are some of the most important tenets of being on that path?
Yeah, I think mastery is intrinsic, and it is very broad, meaning that people can only themselves really perceive and feel that they have mastered something. Mm-hmm. But the mastery of something can be very broad, because I think even when the word is used, people think that it's the president of the United States, or an elected official, or a doctor, or a specialist, or something like that. But people can master relationships, and people can master themselves. People can master being at peace. People can master being a con artist. People can master being a humorist. Or just thinking of Jerry Seinfeld. He's developed mastery just in his scripts and humor, etc. So I think it's important to just put on a piece of paper and really investigate. First of all, that mastery is very broad and it's inside. And then I really first heard about it, thankfully, from a mentor of mine back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where I was just starting my fitness coaching journey. And I was really unaware of what I was doing and kind of unknown to the fact. I knew I really loved fitness and I knew I wanted to share it with other people. But he pointed out that, he sensed, probably from what you sensed from me, and some of the discipline around just trying to be really good at it. And he gave me a fundamental framework of what is mastery and the road to it and the steps. I could see a whole life inside of it, and you move from, in the words that he would put it in 3 different areas, is you move from being a technician in the journey of mastery, where if you could just think about it, you're just picking up all these skills. It's we'll take the fitness coach example. It's you're every second weekend you're away doing a new cert, PRI, DNS, FMS. Yep. Today is all the words, right? But that's what you're probably doing, and you're reading books, and you're in the trenches, and you got all kinds of piss and vinegar, But then over time, you move from that technician into the craftsman, and so that's a secondary journey of that for mastery, where you're not just learning about how to do this thing. You're now becoming it. It's embodying you. So for a fitness coach, as an example, when you're in the craftsman area, you meet someone in an elevator, and for the first time in a number of years, they're like, so what do you do? And you're like, I'm a fucking fitness coach. Mm-hmm. You're embodying it now, right? It's a part of you, you own it. And those are the people that generally can go for decades in there, where they're just hard ass, at the gym, 6 a.m., just in the fucking trenches, right? Just like a craftsman, you're just building your craft, right? And learning about it. But you're not you're starting to validate your own ideas, and, you don't need to do the certifications. I kind of know what that's going to give me, and I know what's good and what's not. You're throwing shit away more than you're taking in shit. And then over time you move to the master, right? And the master is someone who, in any area, but in fitness coaching, you go back to working on the basics. But to your point, you just refine things really tightly, right? Where principles become a big thing that you start discussing, and systems become a big thing that you start to discuss. And I don't even know if I answer your question on the role of mastery or where it sits, but that's where people can kind of think about if they're on the path for it as to how they want to improve it. Just find out where you sit. Are you a technician? Are you a craftsperson? Or are you working on mastering things?
Oh, that's a great answer. When I say the terms unconscious practice versus deliberate practice, what does that mean to you, and how does that play into this big picture?
Oh, wow. Maybe because I've been in a real big rabbit hole on motor development for the past couple of years. I studied it in academia and then kind of just left it alone for a while, but I've been super interested in motor development and development of skills and, biomotor development, biomotor, psychosocial development, et cetera, et cetera. So as soon as you said that, I think of things like flow state. And I think of things like people making things so good that they don't have to think about it, where it's becoming automatic in process. So that's what comes to mind when you say, unconscious in regards to, in a fitness coaching way, we want to get people, especially if they participate in CrossFit, we want to get people to the point where they have very low perception and they are doing whatever tasks come in front of them as unconscious as possible. As crazy as that sounds, like we want them going through repetition and allowing the system to move and churn without them having to think about it, which means the least conscious effort possible. Whereas deliberate means that there's a logical practice or rationality behind what you're trying to do, which, as you know, is important, right? Like that's strategy and tactics and like pacing and correct design, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's how I classify those two things with when you ask that. And I'm sorry it doesn't connect to the mastery piece for it, but that's initially, honestly, what I think of when you ask that.
Perfect. When you hear the words master coach, who's the first person that comes to mind?
Mel Siff, Charles Poloquin, Ian King. Yeah, Louis Simmons.
Pick one of those people for me, and what is it that you admire most about him?
Yeah, I'll pick Charles just specifically because we have a good history. Because in the mid '90s, he was one of the up and coming strength conditioning coaches that was like taking some of that academic information and putting it out into the world, and like, this is the way you may want to think about these ways of getting stronger and strength development and et cetera. And people seem to forget that. Like that guy has not just been around, he's been around the block for 25 years now plus. And I choose him, ironically, just this morning I woke up and he requested to be a friend on Facebook with me.
It's hilarious.
Which is kind of interesting because, I worked as one of his initial interns way back in the day when he started that program before PICP. And I've always just been an advocate of his intelligence on
PIMP. You mean PIMP?
No.
I'm just messing with you. Keep going.
The initial, his knowledge around program design and reps and sets, et cetera, was just, it's just mastery, really. So when I think of that, that's probably why the first person that comes to mind on it, because we have a good past on it, and he just gave me, a lot of knowledge that fast tracked my validation of what I was doing.
Right. One thing I love about Poloquin that I also love about Mike Boyle is they make some of the boldest claims of any strength and conditioning coaches on the planet. And then a couple years later, they're not afraid to change their mind because they've upgraded their knowledge. One thing I notice and I think this goes for people in any discipline, when they first start out, they're super cocky. And I think this is called the Donnie Kruger effect. They're super cocky. They think they know everything. Then they realize how much they don't know. And then they keep going. They realize really how much they don't know. And it's a great sign of a master to be able to stand up in front of thousands of people and confidently share your opinion and take your stance. And then a year later say, you know what, I was wrong. And now here's my belief. And Charles does that to such a great degree. And I love how he says acetyl L-carnitine. Acetyl L-carnitine.
Oh, there's like a list of 100 words that can't be duplicated. The way he says it.
If you were to create a hierarchy of needs, right? Like the CrossFit pyramid, but for coaching, what would that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually should create a system of that, and I actually probably already have it done within our CCP program. But I can tell you in just terms of what my beliefs are is that it's all based upon the function of the coach. But I always say that you have to hire a bedside manner, and you can train skill. So that shows a hierarchy. Is like, if you want to be a fitness coach, you have to be a fanatic and obsessive about your love for fitness, number one. And number two, you just fucking honestly have got to be a good person. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to make this a moral story, but like what defines a good person? And you just got to be a good person. You got to have consistency of self. You got to have competency for the coaching profession, and you got to have care. And we call those the 3 C's because that creates the highest amount of trust. But I'd go after that. Bedside manner is the bottom of the pyramid. And then skill in relationships would be second. And then higher up would be knowledge around movement and movement execution and teaching around that.
I like that. And I totally agree with the bottom of the pyramid there. I forget who said it, but it's like, it's not because it's not a moral thing at all, right? It's totally a competitive advantage to have higher character and to be better at building trust, right? Because no one's going to follow you when things really get tough, when you really go through adversity, if that trust is not there. And so really gaining that trust is an art form.
Yeah, it is. And, I just want to just to tease that out a little bit, because if you're trying to gain trust, you probably have a messed up system already, or you're probably not aligned with your goals. Because trust should be attained by being authentic. Most times trust is not attained because the coach tries to be something they're not. So they get outside of a lane and they learn something on a weekend, and then all of a sudden they're the specialist all week, and it doesn't work for 80% of their clients, and now they've lost trust in the clients. And what the coach should have done is they should have kept that shit in their pocket for a couple of years and let it play out before they decide to get behind it. But that's a deep one, because a lot of those coaches feel the pressure to differentiate themselves by looking smart or looking big or looking tight and ripped, or by traveling the world and looking like they're a big business entrepreneur. And really, it's just a lack of alignment, which doesn't create trust.
So I want to talk a little bit about a phrase that I heard you coin, which is the prescription is the science, and the communication of that prescription is the art. I heard you say somewhere that if like the best preparation for the CrossFit Games, like if you were to build someone from the ground up, it would be bodybuilding. And I'm sure I took that completely out of context. So I want you to explain it. But it looks from the outside looking in more like there are people with more athletic backgrounds, if you will, such as Matt with weightlifting, Katrin with gymnastics, Rich with baseball and football. So why bodybuilding? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I just created that, naming of it because I think that's what people understand, because that's the language they can understand. What I mean, there is a big background on that. What I mean by is the style of is the variations and contractions. Right. So what you get with everything you've described, including all those people, is that doesn't mean that all of them participated in bodybuilding, but what they did do was create a massive inventory of creating solutions to movement with various contractions.
What do you mean by various contractions?
So I'm sure at one point in time, it wasn't a barbell that was overhead for Katrin, but she probably did some various styles of contractions with her shoulder packed and her hands overhead. And she did it probably 1,000 times different ways, where she had it in bent arm, straight arm, a powerful push position, a slow pushing position, et cetera, et cetera. So, and you could, if you study weightlifting and all the supplementary activities for a youth weightlifter, you'd also see a shit ton of bodybuilding style-esque activities that just don't look like someone sitting in front of a mirror with headphones on doing bicep curls.
Right.
But they sure as shit did do some slow activity, and had lots of contractions on tendons, motor units, proprioceptors, et cetera, et cetera. So if all those people have a robust amount of those styles of contractions, then my belief that would be the best base support for what the current sport asks, which is for people to make dynamic contractions as aerobic as possible. It doesn't mean you have to be aerobic, but if you can't sustain with multiple different varied tasks and contractions, you will lose to the next person who can maintain those.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that? Dynamic exercises being aerobic?
Yeah. Well, let's say running. Running. I'll give you an example of someone who will use the, first thing, I don't know why it came to mind, first working at the games last year and excuse me if I get this incorrect, but it was running and putting a sandbag over, was it hay? And then they had to jump over it and burpee on the other side. Is that correct? Yep. Right. So, everything that athlete has to participate, including every time their foot strike hits the ground, is a contraction. Okay. So as they pick up the weight and put it over, as they jump over the other side, as they do a burpee on the other side, as they pick the weight back up, et cetera, all those are all contractions. And they're all different kinds of contractions. Now, depending upon the load and the kind of the task, which, it can get argumentative as the load changes and tasks change and complexity, et cetera, et cetera, but they're all still contractions. So, every foot strike has to be made with the intent to make it as sustainable as possible. And just take it this way, I know it sounds dumb, but the only way that you can make sense of it is that you would say, and then ironically, this is what, fitness is sold as today. You just go as hard as possible and it all just works out in the end. Mm-hmm. And ironically, that's not the case, because if everyone actually took every contraction, ground strike for the foot, burpee over that hay, and then throwing a sandbag, they would be gassed out in 2 minutes, So they have to had to dampen each of those contractions to fundamentally make all of those dynamic contractions, because they're all dynamic, they're not slow, they're not controlled, right? They've had to have made all of those contractions as sustainable as possible, with obviously the highest amount of power output than the next person, right? And then underneath that is just opportunities for investigation into levels of capacity. And obviously there's some people that are better at it than others. But when you actually study the data on it, the people that have the best relative scores in power output are the ones that sustain contractions for the longest periods of time within chosen tasks. So give you an example. You could look at Matt's splits if it's ever possible. I know they had to run a little further per hay position. And excuse me, I don't know how many ones they did, but if we were to actually create split times on it, I would be sure as shit to make you recognize that based upon body weight and total power output, that Matt or the top three had the best quote unquote sustainable dynamic contractions the whole time. So that's what I mean by, in one example, by that. Now there's obviously, that's why I love the sport. There's 6,000 versions of dynamic contractions, the style and what's required, et cetera. But I hope that explains it a little bit.
Absolutely. Next time we do an interview, though, please know in detail every single CrossFit Games workout. That's unacceptable.
True, right? I mean, come on. The 1 year I don't go, and this is what I get.
What's the biggest mistake you see programmers making out there that you're aware of? Or a mistake in the way that athletes are training? Either way.
Yeah, a one,
or several.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a great question, but I would think possibly, and this, it's going to obviously sound biased because I think of it, it's not personalized enough. I think that there could be a little bit more intricacy and care that went into personalizing some things for people. But the athlete themselves believe fundamentally that it's just hard work that levels them up. And there's no one school of thinking and one blog and one place where all the data is anymore. So with all the chaos, it's unmeasurable, where people are like, hey, our program works. Well, you only promote the top 10 of the 1,000 that you have.
Right.
So you could have 9,000 others who think your program sucks shit, right? And actually don't progress. But they're not going to post that on Instagram or Facebook, and it's not measured because it's embarrassing. And listen, dude, I'm not saying that, to hit on any programs, but I had a blog like that. I just recognized it over time. It's like, I cannot fundamentally help a large percentage of these people with a template idea. And the only way I could sleep at night was to try to find a system and a coaching method to allow personalization of those things. So that's the number one thing, is that we still fall prey to like, no one's unique, and we all just need to like work hard, and these basic elements of training will work for everyone. Well, there's too many examples now of people that continue to improve, and also those that are going in the direction of continual mastery towards that aspect, that are doing something that's a little bit more individual for themselves. And I think another one would be measurement. And I think we've got a long ways to go in the technology in order to track that, and actually to figure out readiness and the ability for people, in multiple buckets. Right? I don't just mean, because all people are going after right now is HRV as an example. But I think for the fitness athlete, there's a lot of other things we probably should be measuring that are a little bit indifferent to only looking at the variations of the heart rate, in terms of like metabolic differences and possibly even blood work when it gets scaled up enough that it's not that expensive. I think those things would be really good things to track. So then people can recognize, is like, I'm kind of feeling off, but I'm not really sure. And then they can start recognizing that they need to change gears and shift stuff in the program. So I'll just stop there, but those are probably the two main ones: the lack of personalization, and secondly, the lack of measurement for readiness.
So knowing what you know now, based on the demands of the sport, the exercises and time domains that we know are going to come up, the injuries that you're seeing, what in particular do you think people are missing out on with that lack of individualization?
Yeah, it's not just individualization. Hopefully I'll get to that if you want to remind me. But the reason why we may see that is that, I believe that 95% of everyone that participates in the sport should not be participating, because they actually don't have the ability to participate. Or I should say, they don't have the ability to compete. So it's a big mission. It's a big mission, right? With a lot of sad hearts behind it, right? Because who the fuck am I to tell a lot of people not to participate, right? But that's a fucking bad argument for people who are physically incapable of maintaining power in a task. So my views on it are that we berate the endurance model, of running and cardio and long distance. But we forget that, there's a shit ton of people who enter a marathon, and after the 2 miles, they have to walk the rest of it, right? So, but we berate that. It's like, oh, you're not fucking running, that's just, trying to get a t-shirt and a trophy. Well, ironically now, our entire sport is wrapped around that. How do we get everyone involved in order to create this mass participation and interest in the sport? And where that goes, right? And then you can try to find all the halfways, right? You scale it, or 7 different divisions, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is that you actually should not even be participating. So you can, put the workouts together as you want, and like put more challenging shit on the back end, have an entry, et cetera, et cetera. But, you should start every open workout with is like a 5K entry under 25 minutes, and then into immediately you got to do 5 ring muscle ups, And if you can't do that, you cannot participate in the open. Now, I know that sounds crazy, and I just fucking pulled that out of my ass, but do you see how it would fundamentally change everything that's inside of the competition, right? It's not about participating anymore. It's about competing.
Mm-hmm.
So back to your question, first of all, I'm not even going to really qualify if it is, an injurious thing or whatever, but I just fundamentally see that people actually don't have the ability to participate in the sport. They just don't. And I spend a lot of time on people who are very capable of doing it.
How do you define that? Because it's like...
is when they can compete, Michael. It's when they can compete. Like when they approach the workout and it's not an experience, right? And this is where we have to create the shades, right? This is not fitness, right? You're going in there to fucking beat people, right? And this is why I'm not a part of it. I don't want to cloud that idea. Is right when one person goes in and they want to live long and prosper, right, and fight off disease and hike at 95 and climb a mountain and fucking like fall off and have a wonderful life. They don't need to compete in a workout during the day, right? And over time, everyone will realize this, but that will not lead them to hiking when they're 95.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What might lead to it, which is ironic, is fucking bodybuilding and easy walking. That's a secondary point. But to the other people, if you're trying to compete in a sport, you go in there to with intent and to be able to maintain a standard of power for the entire time that the task is in there. So all we got to do is to look at the best people who can actually have the capabilities. And I know it's really uncomfortable to stretch people's brains, right? Because that's basically what I'm saying is there's only 5,000 people out of 500,000 that actually should be participating in the open. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Because those are the only ones that actually can maintain power through the tasks that are actually required.
Right. So I'm definitely on board with the fact that it is not right for a large percentage of the people, right? They're actually doing more harm to their bodies long term than any kind of good, and it's actually not getting them closer to their goal. However, what do you think? What do you think there is to be said about? I think there's a lot of people that the biggest thing that they get out of competing in, say, the CrossFit Open or a local throwdown, is a subtle or sometimes even not so subtle mindset shift about what they're capable of in life. I think a lot of people, as they get older, they just don't think they're physically capable anymore, right? They've kind of put up their cleats, if you will, and they don't really go for it physically anymore. And I think some of these competitions can really reinvigorate that physical nature in them. And without some competition or what they think of as competition, I think a lot of those people would kind of just be complacent and kind of apathetic when it comes to their physical endeavors. What do you think of that?
I think you've been sold that story,
mm-hmm.
And I think it's just in your language now, to be honest, because that's how everyone speaks about it.
Mm-hmm.
But people have been sold and advertised that story so often that they believe it to be true. And I mean, if that's what you know and that's what you have seen, then that's what you believe is reality. So I can't take that from you, but I'm telling you, it's been sold to you to support the entire undertaking.
Right.
And secondly, the argument to it is what got people to continue to be exercising in 1992?
I have no idea. I was two.
Exactly. It was the connection to them recognizing that fitness is a lifestyle. So they were walking and doing bodybuilding and pressing weights on a Nautilus. Why? Because they were sold the fact that this is not competitive. They were sold the fact that this supports you doing whatever you want to do for the rest of your life that's physical.
Gotcha.
So that would go against the argument that today people, feel they need to do it because there's no other form of competition. I don't think that's a good argument for the reason why people do it.
So something I've been wondering for a while, I think a lot of people, I know a lot of people are wondering, and I'm very curious as to your thoughts on this. Why is Matt Fraser so much more dominant than everyone? You strike me as someone that is really entrenched in even the history of sport. Have you seen this before? What are your thoughts on how he's able to just completely destroy everyone on everything?
I think there's three things. Number one, it's intent, and call it what you want. Intent, heart of a champion, lion, like the lion's heart, et cetera, et cetera. Number two, the science, which is the background and the physicality. And number three is correct training practices and knowing himself. So I'll talk about the first one. I think there are special people out there who, figure out over time what they're good at and what they're capable of, but they have, cards that they will never unfold to people that have such a burning desire and intent to do something that it'll never be explained. It'll never be put in a book, and people can never touch it because it's something that only they own. And we've seen it before with glimpses of Annie's Thorsdottir and Rich Froning, and others. Not probably to this extent thus far. I mean, listen, dude, we're only new in this. In 40 years, we'll maybe laugh at it. If I'm still 84, and I'm probably dead by then, but maybe in 20 years, we'll laugh at it. But the, I just think it's the intent. And it's probably because I'm old and I've probably seen other sporting situations, but, it's in their eyes, in their language, and how they approach things that I think is a separator. Number two, the background, it just makes sense to me, right? Because that's just multiple different forms of resistance in patterns that are obviously inside of CrossFit. Now, the only area that I would think physiologically he probably had to, improve, which could probably take practice over a period of time in a CrossFit setting for a couple of years, is just multiple contractions around the shoulder that are different than what you get within a weightlifting program. Like the hanging dynamic action or the, multiple body weight repetition style stuff overhead, or the horizontal, pushing and pulling activities that are quite varied around the shoulder that was probably not practiced as much in his weightlifting for dynamic contractions. But as I said, all of those styles of contractions for multiple years have made his tendons, and proprioceptors and efficiency of all movements feel like walking at certain loads, just be so easy because of efficiency. And then you take someone who, if their life was in that area of, let's just call it absolute strength and strength speed, and then now all of a sudden you teach him aspects of speed, strength, and absolute speed, it takes a load off his CNS and it fucking makes him a better athlete, So to me, it just makes sense physiologically. And then third, I don't know enough, so I don't want to claim, that I do, but I'm a CrossFit YouTube fan. I watch all the documentaries and the day in the life of and et cetera. And I don't watch it and get emotionally charged on the cool shit inside. I see all the little things, because that's just the coach or the athlete in me. And I see a lot of ritual and rhythm and consistency and great training practices inside of Matt Fraser's background. And I think that's really important for people to look at, that outside of all the fancy shit you might see, there's a lot of real good discipline and consistency and great principles, right? He's just not like, well, what am I going to do today? There's actually some thought and process of that. And then you get someone who does that with a great base support, you get that 7K run at the ranch, which is just like, oh boy, this is a man amongst boys now.
Yeah.
So, good for him for having to putting that package together. And it's good to have those people around right now because it creates a standard of development. And listen, if everyone leaves this podcast or keeps watching him and they start seeing that intent, which can be trained, and also can be visualized and thought about, having a long-term athlete development plan in mind, and then training smart. If people can get that and follow those principles, they'll reach their maximum Matt Fraser,
Right,
not as good as him, but their maximum.
Talk about ritual a little bit. That stood out to me. What's the importance of ritual for an athlete?
Yeah. So what it allows, it's not just for an athlete, but for everyone, it allows you to refine and work on the things that you're really good at, because all the other chaos and minutia falls to the side because you give off energy that you don't want to accept that in your system. So for, rituals in a day, people will have, if you were to sit down and talk to him, like as in the day in the life of, or watch his training videos, it's pretty much very similar each time, because it's always typical. Either Siobhan or someone asks the question, right? Like, tell me about your day. It's like, And were you a Rich fanatic back in the day and watching all of his videos?
Not so much, but I'm sure I watched some.
Yeah, then, if you even review those, it's just like, well, I get up and I do this. And then, it's like, that's ritual. It's like your brain gets used to having, the time and opportunity to live a competitive life day to day. So when you get into the competitive settings, like, oh, this is just what I do. I just wake up and I eat my food and I do this task. And when people don't have that ritual, it shows, number one, a lack of priority for the ritual. And number two, it's going to result in you creating a compensatory model, which means that you're just going to have to duct tape shit all the time and lie to yourself and figure shit out to make stuff happen. And then in the end, guess what ends up happening, right? There's excuses, right? It's like, oh, it didn't work out because of this and I'm injured because of this. Like, no, you didn't have a ritual or consistency in place to actually set a system and consistency down so that you can get it built,
Right. Yeah. To that point, Matt in particular, other than Rich, he's the biggest male, in terms of reach in the sport. Yeah. And you almost never see him like making appearances places or traveling. Sure, he'll do a little bit of that, but not much compared to people that have 1/10 the reach, that are out there doing camps and making appearances. And I'm not knocking those guys that do that, but it just shows you where his priorities lie, right? He doesn't care to make a bunch of extra money right now when he's just so focused on being the best in the world.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago where he was supposed to come. I was looking forward to saying hi at the Granite Games a couple of years ago, and he was expected to come. And I honestly was excited to see him because I knew he was going to compete. But then I heard he made the decision not to, just because he's got his priorities in place. He wanted to focus on his year. And I was like, yeah, that guy has got his shit in line, because our sport wants that, right? Where you want to meet these people and do it and whatnot. But to get to that real high max physical potential, as you know, there's a lot of effort that goes into being good at that. Mm-hmm. And if you want to be even the best for yourself at that, you certainly got to prioritize those things.
I heard a quote recently, as a leader, you have to be where you're trying to take other people. So in terms of physical practice, how important do you think it is for a coach to practice the principles he or she preaches?
Yeah, back to my point on coaching, the way I say it or really believe in it is that I don't want them to be elite at anything, but they sure as shit need to try a lot of things. So, do you need to, be on the treadmill to learn 333 for 3 weeks so you can tell your peeps about it, and give you all the intricacies? No. But should you know how to run? Fuck yes. And that can get a little hairy for people. And it's mostly the lazy template sit down coaches who hate this concept. Because they'll come up with some stupid example of a coach who never touched a football, was the best coach in football. It was like, fuck, give me a break. That's a horrible example. There's just so much shit that goes on in movement control and experience within fitness that I think you don't have to be elite, but you sure as shit have to be disciplined and a fanatic around fitness to coach it.
Right on, man. Moving on to the communication a little bit, how would you communicate with an athlete that is too focused on outcomes? Maybe how their scores compare to others, the weight on the bar, placing in the open, in a way that helps them to index the process a little bit more?
Yeah, great question. I've spent, I don't know why it's the case. I guess it's funny that we spend so much time on this, but it seems like a behavioral issue that's within the sport. And maybe it's in other sports, et cetera. But I generally fix it by getting down to the real reason when I start with an athlete, or when I have started with an athlete, or when I even start with a coach who's coaching an athlete. I just make sure that they recognize you got to get really down to the nitty gritty on who this person is before you get to those points of stress. So it's almost, to answer your question, it's a default problem. It's right. If you've got to this point, that's your issue as a coach, right? So And the way I like to say it is that meet it head on. So that means that when you start with someone, you have to ask all the questions, right? Give me your experiences. How did you feel about that? How do you feel you're perceived based upon that? What's the real reason why you're doing fitness?
Ooh, I love that. How do you feel you're perceived? That's huge.
Yeah. And of course, I'm just being brash for brevity's sake here, right? But that obviously takes a lot of conversation and a lot of sit down opportunities, either online or in person, when you really have to get to the crux of why they're doing what they're doing, right? And I'll just give you an example. We had a couple of athletes on site here throughout the year that, up until the regionals, it took that entire 8 months really to really learn about what really gets them fired up to that point. What's their essence of why they're doing these things. And the beautiful thing around it is that everyone has a different real reason for doing it, And when it comes down to that fine point of stress, right, which is physicality on the line, thrusters and rope climb, is you can't escape that. You either meet it head on and you qualify, meaning qualifying in your mind, right? Or you don't, right? And that's what I love about it. It's so beautiful, is that it allows people to be super vulnerable and find the truth in that, what we were just discussing in figuring out their why. For example, some people are I didn't, not specifically talking about my athletes, but it's some people are I didn't feel the best, or I don't know, something happened out there. It's the folks that were completely aligned didn't have that happen. So that's kind of interesting.
That's super interesting, powerful. So I think I know the answer to this already. I think you answered it earlier, but maybe you can expand on this. So if you were hiring a coach for OPEX HQ, what is the number one characteristic you look for? And if they didn't have it and you were saying, hey, go out and build this, how would you, what kind of feedback could you give them to help them build that characteristic?
Yeah. Well, I'll think of a couple of instances in which I really knew that was probably the case but I'll give you an example. It's if I was in the gym and I was doing my thing, and this new mentee or new possible coach comes in, and we're just standing side by side, and someone new came into the gym, and they went over and introduced themselves. And ask them about what their exercise design is today, and then said, if you need any help on it, just let me know once you get on the floor, and we'll go over it, or I'd like to learn about your warm up and I can help you out. And then, so what I'm trying to describe there is that's the person I'm looking for, right? So someone who has intent, who has the ability to communicate, who has the right care in mind, and someone who's really interested. They really are interested, right? Not interested because it's a script that was written under OPEX. When someone comes in, you go shake, No, they do it because they're interested, I think secondarily, I also want a coach who's sweating on a Sunday morning in their garage gym and no one knows about it. Mm-hmm. It's not posted on Instagram. They don't Facebook it. It's just they're just learning or suffering or going through their own stuff and trying to figure stuff out. That's secondarily what I want. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have that for employment, et cetera. But I'm just trying to give you an example of what I would want in that coach.
Right.
Now, secondarily, how people can get that. Well, I guess you either got it or you don't, And that's the beautiful thing around fitness coaching is that if you don't have the bedside manner and you really don't care and you're in this only for economic reasons or for popularity, get the fuck out. We don't want you in coaching because it doesn't offer us a service over time, Go find something else that you're really good at, or that you really
love, right?
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't make you a bad person, but just fucking you're in the wrong profession.
Yeah, it goes back to your point earlier about making sure that your goals align with what you really want rather than what you think other people think is cool.
Yeah, exactly. But I also, remind people I'm empathetic to that because today there's a lot of voices out there that people are hearing as to what they're supposed to do, right? So maybe I'll be a bit of a voice of reason to say, number one, believe it or not, no one gives a shit about you. And number two, you really are not going to be 100% in anything if you don't, get laser focused on it.
I've got a few wrap up questions, rapid fires, and we'll get out of here. What book have you recommended or given as a gift most often?
How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy by Paul Chek.
Nice. I heard, I think yesterday, when Poloquin can't figure something out with a client, he calls Paul Chek.
Yeah, I don't know if it still does, but back in the day, they used to communicate, which I thought was the coolest thing. It was almost like back in the day, when I was there as an intern with Charles, he would talk about their history, and it was almost like just two of those giants colliding that it was like Avengers, two superheroes getting together. You never thought it was possible. Batman and Superman.
Hell yeah. What's a belief that you hold that if others held would have the biggest effect on their life and or performance in general?
Wow, that's a good one. Can you repeat the question?
Yep. A belief that you hold that if others held would have the biggest effect on their life and or performance in general.
Yeah, I think the wake the fuck up, belief, which just wraps around a word of like, just be aware and be as conscious as possible. Other words that's around that are like alive. Just wake up. If people were after that, it would change things.
And then what's an action that you'd recommend people take immediately to kind of embody that belief?
Movement. And I know that's generalized, but I think, if it's a cultural and geographical and global issue, I think movement will create massive upheaval. If people move more, it will result in a lot, I think, better thoughts and better actions, and then, changes in behavior, etc.
Hell yeah, man. Well, thanks for all your wisdom, all your passion, man. Like I was telling you before the show, I really, really respect the way that you do business, the way that the way that you're leading in terms of thought in this industry. It's great to watch. So I really appreciate it. Where can people find out more about your coaching programs and everything you've got going on?
OPEXFit.com, OPEXFIT.com. I'll get you everything.
And I hear you're on the social medias now.
Yeah. JFits OPEX on Instagram and on Facebook, James Fitzgerald.
Nice. They can find some sweaty pics of you. Awesome, man. Thank you so much for your time. This is great.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Your journey towards better fitness continues. Head over to brutestrengthtraining.com to connect with Michael and his guests. Access links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. That's brutestrengthtraining.com.